Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Kita, and as you've probably already guessed, I am not a 17-year-old student here at Solebury. I've been a journalist for 34 years, and journalism has been beaten up pretty badly lately. You know, by a show of hands, how many people read an actual printed newspaper in the last week? How about a printed magazine? And how about a paperback novel? Remember those? Well, your general lack of enthusiasm does not surprise me. Newspapers are dying, magazines are following close behind, and the whole book publishing industry is in turmoil. But there is one type of journalism that I think is flourishing. I believe it's the most pertinent, the most powerful, and the most promising type of journalism in the world today. And as our society becomes more complex and more stressful, I think we need it now more than ever. And the interesting thing is, I bet you have never heard of it. So let me tell you a little-known story about how this type of journalism came to be. Actually, it was born not very far from here. In 1985, I went to work for a small publishing company which had about 400 employees called Rodale Press. It was headquartered in Emmaus, Pennsylvania. And it was kind of a hippie company back then. Everybody had long hair. They ate sprouts and granola. A lot of them commuted by bicycle to work. And on the lunch break, you could see them playing volleyball outside in their bare feet. Now, the president of this company was a fellow named Bob Rodale, and this was a company that would go on to become the biggest health and wellness publisher in the world. Now, Bob Rodale was a rail-thin man. He had a wispy beard and glasses, and he was quiet and he was shy, but he had a tendency for deep thought, even when he was in public. And Bob Rodale was a big thinker. He was far ahead of his time on many, many things. He was preaching sustainable energy, organic farming, the benefits of physical exercise, and disease prevention long before they were popular and trendy. Well, I was in a meeting in Bob's office one afternoon when he had a sudden insight. He got excited. He really got animated, which was out of character for Bob, and he told us that he had just come up with the two words that defined what he was trying to do with his company and also the world. And those two words were, "You can." Everything, he told us, that Rodale Press did, everything that they published, should not just inform readers, but also empower them to not only change themselves, but their communities and even the world. So that's the day You Can journalism was born. That's the day I became a You Can journalist. And as I said at the outset, while certain parts of journalism are certainly withering today, there are other parts like You Can journalism which are growing. In fact, maybe it could even save journalism. Now here's the really cool thing. Once you understand what You Can journalism is and the principles that underlie it, everybody in this room can be a You Can journalist, too. So this afternoon, I'm going to tell you 3 short stories, each of which underlies a different principle of You Can journalism. Now, the first principle is that You Can journalism is extremely easy to do. I lived more than half my life in a community of about 3,000 people. Maybe you've heard of it. It has a funny name. It's called Schnecksville, Pennsylvania. Now, I've lived most of my life there because it's a friendly community, but Schnecksville has been growing lately, and it's become a little less unfriendly, and this bothered me. So I decided to do a little experiment. What would happen if I would say hello or wave hello to every single person I met in Schnecksville for an entire month? Would it raise the level of friendliness in my little community? Would it change me? So my day usually begins with a walk or a run in my neighborhood. And I'm lucky because within about 10 or 15 minutes, I could be on some really nice rural farm roads. It's beautiful. However, at that time of day, there's a lot of traffic. So kids are going to school, parents are going to work, and I found that the cars were getting closer and closer to me as I was alongside the road. So I tried wearing day-glow clothing, but that really didn't seem to have any effect. And then I even crossed over to the other side of the road, so I was heading against traffic and could hop out of the way if necessary. Frankly, I was starting to get angry. Is it too much to ask to move your vehicle just a few feet away from me? Okay? Was it that these people were so preoccupied, or maybe even worse, they didn't even care? But then I began my experiment. I started to wave at these people, at these drivers. And at first, I only got puzzled looks like, do I know this guy? But then something interesting started to happen. They started to wave back at me. And also, they decided to move their cars a little bit over and gave me a wider berth. Some of them actually crossed the center line when there was nobody coming in the opposite direction. So what day-glow clothing and anger could not accomplish, a simple gesture did. And I had the same effects with supermarket checkout clerks, with crossing guards. Even the guys who picked up my garbage became friendlier and did a better job when I started to say hello and wave at them. Alan Alday, PhD, is a professor at Oklahoma University. And he's one of the few people in the world who has studied the power of hello. So I called him up, and I explained my experiment and my experience, and he listened closely, and he drew one conclusion, and that was that I had become a person to those other drivers. So I wrote an article about my experience, and it was published in Reader's Digest magazine. And back then, Reader's Digest had a circulation of about 3 million and dozens of editions all over the world. And I like to think that people from Peoria to maybe even Prague read that article, and it inspired them to say hello to a few more people every day. You can change the world in this small way. Now, another principle of you can journalism is that it's thought-provoking, not only on the part of the writer, but also on the part of the reader. I used to be a staff writer at Men's Health magazine, and I got an email one day from a doctor in upstate New York who had the same name as me, Joe Kita. And he said he was always getting questions from people saying, how could you write articles for a national magazine at the same time you run a full-time clinical practice? So this kind of got me thinking, okay? Not only was I curious to meet my namesake, this other Joe Kita, but I got to wondering, was this simple yet unique name we had arbitrarily been given, had it influenced our personalities or our lives in some way? In other words, were we at all similar? So I started Googling myself, only it wasn't really myself I was Googling. And I found lots of other Joe Kitas. They were in universities, they were in businesses. There was one who was in divinity school. There was even one who was in prison. So there's the study of names and their implications is called onomastics. That's a really bad name, which is why you've probably never heard of it. And scientists in this field study people like world poker champion Chris Moneymaker, or life insurance salesman Bruce Fear, or copy editor Les Line, or former Playboy magazine editor Peter Moore. These are all real people, by the way. And they found out some really interesting things. For instance, kids, boys in particular, with unusual first names have a tendency to commit more crimes. White names on resumes get more callbacks than black-sounding names. And here's something that's really amazing. People with positive initials, like J-O-Y or H-U-G, live on average 4 years longer than people with neutral or negative initials, like I-L-L. So I called up Dr. Kita, who turned out to be a pediatrician in upstate New York, and I'm not exaggerating, it was like talking to myself. He was very pleasant, he was affable, we even had similar senses of humor. And this got me wondering about my first name of Joe. It's friendly, it's unassuming. Could this have made me a better interviewer? Could this have made me a better journalist? Tell me, do you think I would have been as successful in this business if my name was Kurt Words? And Dr. Joe said the same thing. He said, he's a pediatrician, remember? He says he encourages his little patients to call him Dr. Joe because it's less intimidating and more approachable for them. So I wrote a quirky article about all of this, and I like to think that people who read it became thoughtful about their own lives. You know, maybe it's not so much your schooling or your parents or your friends or where you live that have put you where you are in life, but maybe, just maybe, a small or maybe even a bigger part was influenced by just the name that you were given. Now, there's 1,000 quirky, fascinating things like this in the world. Journalism now, technology has put the world's knowledge at your fingertips. You can explore and find the answers to things like this, and you can share them. Be curious. Another principle of you can journalism is that it's a lot of fun. Okay? When I turned 40, I had a bit of a midlife crisis. But instead of going out and buying a sports car or cheating on my wife, I made a list of my biggest regrets in life. What would happen, I thought, if I went back to these crossroads to determine if I had made the right decision, or maybe if I tried the other decision? What would happen? Would I find solace? Would I find frustration? Or would I find something else? Let me give you an example. When I was a senior in high school, I went out for the basketball team. Now, never mind, I had never played high school basketball before. When you're a senior in high school, you think you can do anything. You are invincible. Well, I was promptly cut. And back in those politically incorrect days, the cuts were posted publicly in the hall. So it was a public humiliation. It was the adolescent equivalent of being fired. So that regret always stuck with me. So when I made my list of regrets, I wanted to go back and revisit that one. I always was convinced that I had the athletic ability to make that team. So I called up the principal at my alma mater, Notre Dame High School in Green Pond, Pennsylvania, and I told him I was a journalist, that I was going to write a story about this, and was there any way he would let me try out for the high school basketball team at age 40. So you could imagine his skepticism, but after signing a stack of legal waivers about an inch thick, he and the coach permitted me to try out for 2 weeks with the team with the honest promise that afterwards they would give me an answer as to if I made it or not. Well, to make a long story short, I learned that speed and quickness departs faster than we think, and that intelligence does not compensate. But I'm proud to say that I attended every practice. I ran every single line drill. I made my share of baskets. And at the end of those 2 weeks, the coach called me into his office and he said, "Joe, you're not good enough to be a starter on this team. However, I admire your heart. You're in pretty good shape. And I would have you as my 7th or 8th guy who I would bring in later in the game to run and tire out the other team." Now, even though league rules prohibited me from actually playing in any games, I left that office soaring higher than Michael Jordan. You know, what else could I do next? Maybe I could retake my SATs. Or maybe I could ask a cheerleader to the prom. So when that story ran in Men's Health magazine, it actually got a bigger reaction than any story that had ever been published in that magazine. There were thousands of guys all across the country who were living vicariously through me and believing, if only from their couches, that if they set their minds to it, you can still realize your dreams. So, to the critics of journalism who contend that it is dying, that it's lost its dignity and its power, I say, well, while certain parts may be, others are just coming into their own. You know, one of the fastest growing parts of book publishing is memoir, especially by first-time authors. Why do you think that's so? Well, I believe it's because we've grown jaded with our traditional sources of advice, like sports stars, celebrities, politicians, and businessmen, and are instead turning to each other. We are learning that there is wisdom in every man and that we should share it. So, UCAN journalism lies at the heart of this. Taking an experience that you've had, or a slice of your life, becoming thoughtful about it, and then sharing it with someone. You don't need a degree in journalism to do this. You don't need to publish it in a newspaper or a magazine or a book. You can tweet it, you can blog it, you could podcast it, you could post it on Facebook, okay? Technology has opened up and finally made journalism democratic. Each and every one of you can be a journalist. But here's the important thing. Think about what has happened to you and what you are writing about. Don't just report it, think about the significance. In a world of mindless information, be mindful. Instead of just informing, inspire. Instead of just entertaining, empower. Be like Bob Rodale. Be curious. Be a big thinker. And believe that you can be a change agent. You know, there's a lot of big ideas in the world today, perhaps too many of them. But what the world needs is more little ideas that we can act on daily. Now that journalism is open to everyone, I encourage you to get started because you can. Thank you.